"You don't belong here," Officer Ryan Cole said coldly, tightening his grip on the fire hose as the blast of icy water slammed into the older black woman hard enough to send her stumbling backward across the sidewalk. Gasps rippled through the crowded downtown bus station. Coffee cups froze halfway to mouths. A teenager lowered his earbuds. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," but nobody stepped forward. Water sprayed across the cracked pavement in shimmering sheets beneath the pale glow of the streetlights, soaking the blankets, paper bags, and medical supplies scattered beside the woman's feet. Evelyn Brooks caught herself against a rusted bench, breathing hard as water dripped from her silver curls and dark green coat. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the bitter November cold settling into her bones. Ryan stood 10 feet away beside the patrol SUV, jaw tight, chest puffed with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. His bodycam blinked with a tiny blue light against his uniform. "I told you already," he barked loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear, "this area's been cleared. You can't camp here." Evelyn looked up slowly. Her face carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had survived too many storms to be shaken by another one. Around her lay dozens of small care packages she had spent the evening handing out to homeless veterans near the station. Sandwiches wrapped in foil. Bottles of water. Travel-sized inhalers. Dry socks folded neatly into plastic bags. One of the sandwiches floated through a puddle near Ryan's boots. He glanced down at it with visible disgust. "You people leave this place looking like a dump," he muttered. A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. One man pulled out his phone and started recording. Another woman shook her head but stayed silent. Evelyn slowly pushed wet hair away from her face and reached for a small black duffel bag that had tipped onto its side during the chaos. "Sir," she said softly, her voice steady despite the cold rattling in her lungs, "there's an elderly veteran over there struggling to breathe." She pointed toward a thin man slumped against the station wall 20 feet away. The man wheezed weakly, clutching his chest beneath a threadbare army jacket. Ryan barely looked. "That's not your concern anymore," he snapped. "Pack your things and move." But Evelyn ignored him. Her knees cracked as she crouched beside the soaked duffel bag and searched through it carefully with trembling fingers. Ryan's eyes narrowed instantly. "Hey," he barked, stepping closer, "keep your hands where I can see them." The crowd went still again. Water dripped steadily from the hose onto the pavement with a soft ticking sound. Evelyn paused only for a second before pulling out a sealed medical pouch and an inhaler. Without another word, she stood and hurried toward the struggling man. Ryan shouted. "I said stop." But she kept moving. Her soaked sneakers splashed through puddles as she dropped to one knee beside the veteran. "Easy now," she whispered gently, placing the inhaler into his shaking hands. "Slow breaths. That's it." The man's chest trembled violently as he inhaled. Ryan stormed forward, frustration burning across his face. "You think you can ignore a direct order?" he demanded. He grabbed the strap of Evelyn's duffel bag and yanked it hard. The bag flipped upside down onto the wet sidewalk. Bottles rolled everywhere. Gauze packs scattered into puddles. Then something small and metallic slid across the pavement and stopped directly beside Ryan's polished boot. The crowd fell silent. Ryan looked down. A weathered military medal rested against the concrete beneath the flashing red and blue reflection of his patrol lights. Ryan Cole stared at the medal near his boot as rainwater slid across the sidewalk in thin silver streams beneath the flashing patrol lights. For a moment, the noise of the station faded. The wheezing buses. The distant sirens. The murmuring crowd with phones raised chest high. Everything seemed to blur around the small bronze star resting on the pavement. Evelyn reached down carefully and picked it up before the water could carry it into the gutter. Her fingers moved slowly, almost protectively, as if the medal carried more weight than metal should. Ryan cleared his throat and forced his expression back into place. "Military surplus. Shops sell fake medals all the time," he said sharply, though his voice lacked the same confidence as before. Evelyn did not answer. She simply wiped rainwater from the metal with the sleeve of her soaked coat and tucked it gently into her bag beside folded blankets and medical tape. The homeless veteran beside her finally managed a steady breath. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he leaned against the cold brick wall. "Thank you," he whispered weakly. Evelyn offered him a faint smile. "You are going to be all right now." Ryan folded his arms tightly across his chest, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling settling behind his ribs. Something about the woman bothered him now, and it was not just the medal. It was the way she carried herself. Calm. Measured. Like someone who had spent years walking through chaos without letting it swallow her whole. Most people backed down the moment he raised his voice. Most people looked afraid. Evelyn Brooks looked tired, but not afraid. A city bus hissed to a stop nearby, releasing warm exhaust into the freezing air. The orange station lights reflected against the puddles around them, making the soaked pavement shimmer like broken glass. One of the younger officers stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Ryan, maybe we should just move along," he muttered carefully. She was helping people. Ryan shot him a quick glare. "You want civilians setting up camps outside a public station now?" The younger officer looked away immediately. Evelyn slowly stood, one hand pressed against the bench beside her for balance. Up close, Ryan noticed the faint lines beneath her eyes and the stiffness in her shoulders. She looked older than he first thought. Late 60s maybe. But there was something steady in her gaze that made her seem stronger than half the men on the force. She zipped her soaked duffel bag closed and began gathering the remaining supplies scattered across the sidewalk. A teenage girl from the crowd quietly stepped forward to help collect the fallen water bottles. Then another man bent down to grab blankets from a puddle. Ryan watched the scene with growing irritation. 10 minutes ago everyone had stood back silently. Now they looked at Evelyn like she mattered. Like she belonged there more than he did. "You people do not understand," he snapped loudly, trying to regain control of the moment. "This is how these areas turn dangerous." Evelyn finally looked directly at him again. Rain clung to her eyelashes. "Feeding hungry veterans makes a city dangerous?" she asked softly. Ryan opened his mouth but nothing came out immediately. A cold gust of wind swept through the station, rattling loose newspapers along the curb. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed through downtown. The silence stretched too long. Then the homeless veteran beside the wall spoke again, this time stronger. "She comes here every Thursday night," he said. "Has for almost 3 years." Several others nearby nodded quietly. One woman wrapped in 2 oversized coats pointed toward Evelyn's bag. "She paid for my antibiotics last winter," she whispered. Another man added, "When my brother froze out here during that snowstorm, she sat beside him all night in the ER." Ryan felt dozens of eyes slowly turning toward him now instead of her. The pressure in his chest tightened. His radio crackled suddenly at his shoulder, making him flinch slightly. "Unit 12, report status." Ryan grabbed the radio automatically but kept staring at Evelyn as she lifted the heavy duffel bag over her shoulder. The soaked fabric pulled against her thin frame, yet she never complained. She simply looked exhausted. Then, as she adjusted the strap, something slipped partially from the side pocket of the bag. A faded photograph sealed inside clear plastic. Ryan only caught it for a second before Evelyn pushed it back into place, but the image hit him like ice water. A flooded street. A rescue boat. And a frightened little blonde boy wrapped tightly in the arms of a younger Evelyn Brooks. Ryan could not stop staring at the image inside Evelyn's bag. The photograph had only flashed into view for a second before disappearing beneath folded blankets and medical supplies, but something about it hooked deep into his memory like a rusted nail. Floodwater. A rescue boat. A frightened blonde child wrapped in silver emergency foil. His chest tightened. Unexpectedly. "Officer," the younger cop beside him asked quietly. Ryan blinked hard and grabbed his radio tighter. "Unit 12, situation under control," he muttered into the receiver before clipping it back onto his shoulder. His voice sounded different now. thinner somehow. Evelyn adjusted the heavy duffel bag against her shoulder and turned back toward the homeless veteran she had helped moments earlier. "You need somewhere warm tonight," she said gently. "The shelter on Mason Street still has open beds after midnight." The older man nodded slowly, still clutching the inhaler she had given him like it was gold. Around them, the crowd had changed completely. The tension was no longer aimed at Evelyn. It floated toward Ryan now in silent waves. He could feel it in the lowered stairs, the quiet whispers, the phone still recording from across the station. Rain continued falling in a fine mist that softened the glow of the streetlights overhead. Water dripped steadily from the brim of Ryan's patrol cap onto his shoulders. For the first time since arriving, he suddenly felt cold. Evelyn bent carefully to pick up the final package from the sidewalk. As she straightened again, her knees stiffened slightly with age and exhaustion. Ryan noticed it immediately. She was tired. Really tired. Not dangerous. Not unstable. Just worn down by years that had clearly asked too much from her. Yet somehow she still spent her nights helping strangers beneath bus station lights while most of the city hurried past pretending not to notice. Ryan swallowed hard. "Where did you get that medal?" he asked suddenly. Evelyn paused. For a moment, only the sound of distant traffic moved through the station. She looked at him calmly. "I earned it," she answered. No anger. No sarcasm. Just truth. Ryan shifted his weight uneasily. "Army?" he asked. "Navy Medical Corps," she replied quietly. The younger officer beside Ryan looked surprised. "You served?" Evelyn gave a small nod. 22 years. A few people in the crowd exchanged stunned looks. Ryan felt something uncomfortable crawl beneath his skin. 22 years. That was longer than he had even been alive. He looked at the soaked supplies around her feet again. Bandages. Antibiotics. Emergency inhalers. Thermal blankets. Suddenly the pieces no longer matched the version of her he had created in his head 10 minutes earlier. A city bus pulled away from the curb with a long mechanical groan, headlights cutting briefly across Evelyn's face. Ryan noticed a faint scar near her jawline. Another near her left wrist. Old scars. The kind left by hard years and harder choices. Evelyn turned slightly and reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a folded handwritten list protected inside a plastic sandwich bag. Names. Medication schedules. Shelter locations. Emergency contacts. She checked one line quickly before looking back toward the row of bundled figures near the station entrance. "I still have 2 people to find before the temperature drops below freezing tonight," she said softly. Ryan frowned before he could stop himself. "You do this every week?" "Every Thursday," the homeless veteran answered for her. "Even during snowstorms?" Ryan looked around slowly. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smirked. The phones recording him suddenly felt heavier than bricks. A woman standing near the station doors crossed her arms tightly and shook her head under her breath. "My brother served in Fallujah," she said quietly. People like her kept him alive. Ryan felt heat rise into his face despite the cold rain. Evelyn slipped the list back into her pocket and adjusted the strap of her bag once more. Then, before turning away, she looked directly at Ryan again. Her eyes were tired but steady. "You saw wet clothes and a black woman sitting near a bus station," she said softly. "You never once asked why I was here." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Ryan opened his mouth, searching for something to say, but before he could answer, a deep raspy voice suddenly echoed from the far edge of the station. "Medic Brooks." Every head turned at once. An older homeless man standing beneath the awning stared at Evelyn with wide disbelief slowly filling his weathered face. The old man beneath the station awning stepped forward slowly, his hands trembling so badly that the paper coffee cup he held splashed onto the concrete. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof above him while every person near the sidewalk turned to stare. "Medic Brooks," he repeated, his voice rough with disbelief. Evelyn froze for half a second. Then something inside her expression softened completely. Not fear. Not tension. Recognition. "Walter," she whispered. The older man laughed weakly under his breath, almost like he could not believe she was real either. His grey beard was soaked from the mist outside, and his oversized army jacket hung loose from his thin frame. "Lord have mercy," he muttered. "I knew it was you." Ryan watched carefully as Walter shuffled closer through the puddles. The crowd parted quietly for him. "You remember me?" Walter asked. Evelyn's tired smile reached her eyes for the first time all night. "2nd Battalion," she answered gently. "Kandahar Field Hospital. You used to sneak extra coffee packets into my station every morning." Walter let out a broken laugh that turned halfway into tears. "You kept me breathing after that roadside blast," he said. "Doctors back home said I should not even be walking." Ryan felt the air shift around him again. The younger officer beside him lowered his eyes toward the wet pavement. Evelyn reached forward and steadied Walter carefully by the arm. Her movements were automatic. Precise. Years of medical training still lived inside every motion she made. Walter looked down at the soaked supplies around her feet and his face darkened with confusion. "What happened here?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered right away. The silence itself said enough. Walter slowly turned toward Ryan. The old veteran's expression changed the moment he saw the hose lying beside the patrol vehicle. "You did this?" he asked. Ryan straightened instinctively, defensive tension tightening his shoulders again. "Sir, the area was being cleared," he answered firmly, though his voice no longer carried the same edge. Walter stared at him for several long seconds. Rainwater rolled down the deep creases in his face. "That woman carried wounded men through floodwater with a fractured rib," he said quietly. "I watched her stay awake for 36 straight hours stitching soldiers back together while rockets fell outside the tents. The station fell completely silent except for distant traffic humming through downtown." Walter pointed toward Evelyn with shaking fingers. "You see an old black woman with wet clothes," he continued softly, "but I see the medic who held my hand when I thought I was dying." Ryan swallowed hard. Something inside his chest felt dangerously unsteady now. Evelyn looked uncomfortable with the attention. She lowered her eyes slightly and adjusted the strap of her bag again. "Walter," she said gently, "you need dry clothes before this temperature drops any further." But Walter ignored her. His eyes stayed locked on Ryan. "Do you even know what Purple Heart recipients sacrifice for this country?" he asked. Ryan hesitated. The younger officer beside him quietly stepped backward toward the patrol SUV, suddenly wanting distance from the entire scene. Across the sidewalk, more phones continued recording. Ryan could almost feel the city watching him through those tiny glowing screens. Then Walter noticed the faded photograph partially visible inside Evelyn's bag. His expression shifted again. "You still carry that picture?" he asked softly. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the bag. For the first time all night, real emotion flickered across her face. Sadness. Deep and old. She nodded once. Walter looked toward Ryan slowly. "That boy in the photo," he said carefully. "She pulled him out of Katrina floodwaters herself after his entire street went under." Ryan felt his pulse stumble inside his throat. The station lights suddenly seemed too bright. The rain too cold. He stared at the edge of the photograph sticking from Evelyn's bag while something buried deep in his memory began pulling violently at the edges of his mind. Floodwater rushing through a dark neighborhood. Sirens. Cold air. A woman's voice telling him to keep breathing. Ryan's stomach tightened. No. It could not be. Evelyn quickly pushed the photograph deeper into the bag as if she did not want anyone seeing it. But Ryan had already seen enough. Because for the first time since that terrible night 20 years ago, he recognized the silver emergency blanket wrapped around the terrified little boy in the picture. He remembered wearing it himself. Ryan felt the world around him narrow into a dull ringing silence as he stared at the photograph hidden inside Evelyn's bag. Rain tapped softly against the station roof above them, but suddenly he was no longer standing beneath downtown lights surrounded by strangers and flashing patrol cars. He was 8 years old again. Cold. Terrified. Crying inside rising floodwater while sirens echoed through the darkness of New Orleans. His breathing became shallow. The memory hit him in broken flashes. A house groaning under black water. His mother screaming somewhere far away. A rescue boat slamming against floating debris. Then strong arms lifting him from a second-story window while rain hammered the city like bullets from the sky. Ryan blinked hard and looked back at Evelyn. His throat tightened painfully. Walter watched him carefully now, as if he could see the realization forming in real time. "You remember, do you not?" the old veteran asked quietly. Ryan did not answer immediately. He could not. Because another memory had surfaced now. A woman wrapped in a soaked military jacket kneeling beside him inside a crowded shelter gymnasium. Dark skin. Tired eyes. Gentle hands checking his pulse while emergency generators hummed through the night. "Stay awake for me, sweetheart," she had whispered while wrapping him tighter in a silver thermal blanket. Ryan's stomach twisted violently. He looked down at the hose near his feet, then back at the woman standing quietly in front of him. The same woman. Older now. Tired. Soaked by freezing water he himself had blasted at her only minutes ago. Evelyn seemed to notice the change in his face immediately. Her expression softened slightly, almost sadly. "You were the little boy from St. Claude Avenue," she said quietly. Ryan's eyes widened. Hearing the street name felt like someone opening a locked door inside his mind. "Your mother had the blue porch with wind chimes," Evelyn continued softly. "You would not stop asking where your dog was." The crowd around them had gone completely silent now. Even the traffic noise beyond. The station seemed distant somehow. Ryan's lips parted slightly. "Rusty," he whispered before he could stop himself. Evelyn nodded once. That was his name. Ryan stared at her in disbelief. Nobody else knew that. Not even most of his relatives remembered the dog anymore. But she did. Because she had been there. A wave of shame rolled through him so suddenly that he felt physically unsteady. He glanced around at the soaked blankets, scattered medicine, and the phone still recording every second of this moment. His own bodycam continued blinking blue against his chest like a witness refusing to look away. "Oh my God," the younger officer beside him whispered under his breath. Ryan dragged one trembling hand across his face. Water dripped from his sleeve onto the sidewalk. He started weakly, but the words collapsed before reaching the air. Evelyn shifted the heavy bag on her shoulder again. "Your mother cried for 20 minutes after they found you alive," she said softly. "You kept asking if the water was coming back." Ryan closed his eyes briefly. The memory slammed into him with painful clarity now. He remembered her voice. Calm in the middle of panic. Steady while the world drowned around them. His chest tightened harder with every passing second. Walter stepped closer slowly. "That woman saved more people than you could count," he said quietly. "And tonight she came here to help forgotten veterans stay alive through another freezing night." Ryan looked down at his boots. Water pooled around them beneath the flashing red and blue lights. He suddenly hated the sight of the hose lying beside the patrol SUV. Hated the image of himself standing there with power in his hands while the woman who once carried him to safety stood shivering beneath freezing water. Evelyn turned slightly toward the station entrance, clearly ready to leave before the situation became even more uncomfortable. But Ryan finally spoke again, his voice rough and low. "Why did you not tell me?" Evelyn paused without facing him fully. Rain glimmered across her silver curls beneath the station lights. "Because kindness is not supposed to come with a resume," she answered softly. Those words hit Ryan harder than anything else had all night. He stood frozen while Evelyn took a slow step away from him toward the freezing darkness beyond the station. Then suddenly Ryan realized something that made his heart drop even further. She was limping. Ryan noticed the limp immediately once Evelyn stepped away from the station lights. It was subtle at first, almost hidden beneath the heavy duffel bag pulling against her shoulder, but now that he saw it, he could not unsee it. Every third step carried a slight hesitation, like pain traveling quietly through her hip before she forced herself forward again. Rain drifted through the cold night air in soft silver lines while buses came and went behind them with long mechanical sighs. Nobody in the crowd moved anymore. They simply watched her walk away carrying soaked blankets and medicine meant for people most of the city refused to see. Ryan felt something crack inside his chest. He called suddenly. Evelyn stopped but did not turn around right away. Water dripped steadily from the edge of her coat onto the pavement. Ryan stepped forward slowly, no longer sounding like the officer who had arrived 20 minutes earlier full of certainty and command. "Your leg," he said awkwardly. "You are hurt." Evelyn glanced down briefly before looking back toward the dark street ahead of her. "Old injury," she answered quietly. "Cold weather makes it worse." Walter shook his head beside the station wall. "She got that injury carrying civilians through floodwater after a bridge collapsed," he muttered softly. Ryan closed his eyes for half a second. Every new thing he learned about her made his own actions feel smaller somehow. "Mina!" The younger officer quietly walked over to the patrol SUV and shut off the flashing lights without saying a word. Suddenly the station looked calmer beneath the soft amber glow of the overhead lamps. Ryan stared at the hose still lying across the sidewalk like evidence nobody could erase. He bent slowly and picked it up. Water streamed from the nozzle onto his boots before he shut the valve completely. The silence around him felt heavy now. Humid. Full of judgment he did not know how to escape. Evelyn adjusted the strap of her bag again, wincing slightly this time. Ryan noticed it immediately. "You should not be carrying all that weight alone," he said. She gave him a tired look over her shoulder. "Yet here we are." The words were not cruel. That somehow made them worse. Ryan swallowed hard. A city bus rolled past, spraying mist across the curb while distant sirens echoed somewhere far downtown. The cold seemed sharper now that the adrenaline inside him had faded. He looked at Evelyn standing there soaked to the bone because of him and suddenly remembered another image from childhood. Sitting inside a crowded emergency shelter wrapped in blankets while a woman in military scrubs moved non-stop through exhausted families handing out water bottles and checking temperatures. He remembered her limp now too. Even back then she had been injured. But she kept moving anyway. Ryan rubbed a trembling hand across the back of his neck. "I thought," he started before stopping. Evelyn finally turned fully toward him. Her eyes looked exhausted beneath the station lights. "You thought I did not belong here," she finished softly. Ryan lowered his gaze. He could not deny it. Not after what everyone had seen. Walter slowly approached them both, his weathered boots scraping against the wet concrete. "The thing about uniforms," the old veteran said quietly, "is they only mean something if the person wearing them remembers why they put them on." Ryan stared at the silver badge pinned to his chest. For years he had worn it proudly. Worked overtime shifts. Chased promotions. Talked about protecting the city. But standing there now beside Evelyn Brooks, he suddenly wondered how long it had been since he actually looked at people before judging them. A sharp gust of wind swept through the station, making Evelyn shiver despite herself. Ryan noticed instantly. Without thinking, he pulled off his heavy police jacket and stepped toward her. "Take this," he said quietly. Evelyn looked surprised. "You will freeze." "I think you already did enough freezing for one night because of me," Ryan answered. The crowd around them went silent again. Evelyn hesitated before finally accepting the jacket slowly. The sleeves were too large on her smaller frame. Ryan remembered suddenly that same oversized police jacket wrapped around him as a child inside the flood shelter while a medic told him he was safe now. His throat tightened painfully. Evelyn slipped her arms into the coat carefully, then paused when something brushed against the inside pocket. Her fingers touched a small object hidden there. Ryan's expression changed instantly, because he suddenly remembered exactly what was inside that pocket. A folded photograph of his mother standing beside the woman who had saved his life 20 years ago. Evelyn's fingers slowly slipped into the inside pocket of Ryan's police jacket while cold rain whispered across the station roof above them. The crowd stood perfectly still now, almost afraid to interrupt whatever invisible thread had connected these two people across 20 years of silence. Ryan watched her carefully as she pulled out the folded photograph hidden inside the pocket. The edges were worn soft from years of being carried around. Water dripped from Evelyn's sleeve onto the picture as she unfolded it beneath the amber station lights. Ryan already knew what she would see before she even looked down. His chest tightened anyway. It was an old photograph taken inside a crowded emergency shelter after Hurricane Katrina. A younger Ryan sat wrapped in a silver thermal blanket beside his exhausted mother. Between them knelt Evelyn Brooks wearing navy medical scrubs stained with mud and floodwater, one arm around Ryan's shoulders while his mother cried openly beside her. The image froze the entire station in silence. Evelyn stared at the picture for several seconds without speaking. Then a faint, almost broken smile touched her lips. "Your mother kept copies of this," she said quietly. Ryan nodded once. "She said the woman in that photo gave her son back." Walter looked away for a moment, wiping his eyes with rough fingers. The younger officer near the patrol vehicle shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure where to look anymore. Evelyn carefully handed the photograph back to Ryan like it was fragile glass. "Your mother was strong," she said. Softly. Ryan swallowed hard. "She passed away 3 years ago." Evelyn lowered her eyes immediately. "I am sorry." Ryan looked down at the photograph in his hands. Rain tapped steadily against the pavement around his boots while distant traffic hummed through the sleeping city. "Before she died," he said slowly, "she used to tell people about the medic who carried me through chest-deep water after the rescue boat stopped coming." Evelyn gave a faint shake of her head. "A lot of people carried each other back then. Not everybody stayed behind after the evacuation deadline," Ryan replied quietly. "She said you did." Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead she glanced toward the homeless veterans huddled beneath the station awning waiting for blankets and medicine. "Some people still needed help," she finally said. The simplicity of her answer hurt Ryan more than any accusation could have. He looked around at the wet sidewalk, the soaked supplies, the phone still recording, and the hose lying abandoned near the curb. Shame settled deeper into his chest with every passing second. "I treated you like," his voice cracked slightly before he forced himself to continue. "I treated you like you were nothing." Evelyn looked at him calmly beneath the oversized police jacket draped around her shoulders. "No," she said softly. "You treated me like you thought I was invisible." Ryan felt those words hit somewhere deep inside him because he realized instantly she was right. He had not seen her. Not really. He saw wet clothes. Dark skin. A tired woman sitting near a bus station. His assumptions had arrived long before his humanity did. Walter stepped beside Evelyn slowly. "A badge is supposed to protect people," the old veteran said quietly. "Not decide who deserves dignity." Ryan lowered his head. Around them, the station had gone completely still except for the rain and the occasional hiss of bus brakes in the distance. Then something unexpected happened. Evelyn reached down into her bag again and pulled out one of the drywall blankets she had managed to save from the water. She walked slowly toward a shivering homeless woman sitting near the bus bench and wrapped the blanket gently around her shoulders without saying a word. Ryan watched in stunned silence. Even after everything that had happened tonight, even after the humiliation and cold and pain, Evelyn's first instinct was still to help someone else. The homeless woman looked up at her with watery eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Evelyn smiled softly. "Everybody deserves warmth tonight." Ryan felt his throat tighten painfully again. Because standing there beneath the station lights, he suddenly understood the difference between authority and character. One came from a uniform. The other came from the choices a person made when nobody was watching. And the woman he had publicly humiliated possessed more real strength than anyone he had ever met. Then his radio crackled sharply through the silence. Unit 12, dispatch said urgently. Supervisor en route to your location. We received multiple civilian complaints and video footage from the station. Ryan slowly closed his eyes. The consequences had finally arrived. The sharp crackle from Ryan's radio seemed to echo through the entire station as rain drifted softly beneath the amber lights overhead. Unit 12, supervisor arriving in 2 minutes, dispatch repeated. Ryan slowly lowered the radio from his shoulder while dozens of silent eyes remained fixed on him. The cold no longer bothered him now. Shame did. It sat heavy in his chest like wet concrete. Across the sidewalk, Evelyn continued handing out supplies as though none of this had ever been about her. She moved slowly because of the pain in her leg, but her hands remained steady as she passed dry socks to one veteran and checked the pulse of another older man sitting near the bus bench. Ryan watched her in disbelief. Most people would have screamed at him by now. Threatened lawsuits. Demanded revenge. Evelyn Brooks simply kept helping people. The younger officer finally stepped closer again. Ryan, he said quietly, maybe you should say something before Lieutenant Harris gets here. Ryan swallowed hard. His eyes drifted toward the phone still recording from every angle. One video had probably already spread halfway across the city by now. Maybe farther. But suddenly that was not the thing frightening him most anymore. What frightened him was the realization that he had become the kind of man his mother warned him about growing up. A man who stopped seeing people as human beings. A pair of headlights turned into the station entrance, washing silver light across the rain-soaked pavement. The police supervisor had arrived. Ryan's stomach tightened instantly. Lieutenant Harris stepped out of the black SUV wearing a long navy coat and a hard expression that usually meant somebody's career was about to change forever. He glanced first at the crowd, then at the hose near the curb, then finally at Ryan standing motionless beneath the station lights. Officer Cole, Harris said sharply. What exactly happened here tonight? Ryan opened his mouth, but before he could answer, several voices from the crowd started speaking at once. He sprayed her with freezing water. She was helping veterans. Everybody recorded it. Harris raised one hand calmly and the crowd quieted again. Then his eyes landed on Evelyn. For a second his expression shifted completely. Surprise. Dr. Brooks, he said quietly. Evelyn looked up from the medical pouch she was organizing. Good evening, Lieutenant. Harris walked toward her immediately. I did not know you were back downtown again, he said. The shelter director said you had surgery last winter. Ryan looked up sharply. Surgery? Harris noticed the confusion on Ryan's face and turned slowly toward him. This woman volunteers at half the veteran shelters in the city, he said firmly. She received the governor's humanitarian medal 3 years ago. Ryan felt the air leave his lungs. Evelyn gave a tired smile. It was not a big deal. It was to the families sleeping under bridges during that freeze, Harris replied quietly. The station went silent again. Rain tapped softly against the roof while steam rose from a nearby saw grate into the freezing night air. Ryan stared at Evelyn standing there in his police jacket helping people after everything he had done. He could not carry the weight inside his chest anymore. Slowly, he stepped forward until he stood directly in front of her. The cameras lifted higher immediately. Ryan ignored them. His voice shook slightly when he finally spoke. I owe you more than an apology, he said quietly. Evelyn looked at him calmly without interrupting. Ryan forced himself to continue. You saved my life when I was a child. And tonight, he glanced down at the soaked sidewalk around them. Tonight I treated you with disrespect I cannot take back. The younger officer lowered his eyes. Even Lieutenant Harris remained silent now. Ryan took a slow breath. My mother used to tell me that the people who save lives rarely look powerful when they do it, he admitted. She said real courage usually looks tired. Evelyn's expression softened slightly at that. Ryan's throat tightened again. I forgot that somewhere along the way. Rainwater dripped steadily from the station roof between them. Then, to everyone's surprise, Evelyn reached out and gently adjusted the crooked collar of Ryan's uniform jacket still hanging partly off his shoulder. Her hands moved with the same quiet kindness she had shown everyone else all night. Then remember it now, she said softly. Ryan felt his eyes burn unexpectedly. He lowered his head for a moment, unable to speak. And standing there beneath the glow of the station lights, surrounded by strangers and veterans and soaked blankets and cameras still recording everything, Ryan Cole finally understood that the strongest person in the entire city had never been the man holding the hose. By the time the rain finally stopped, the station looked different somehow. Quieter. Softer. The puddles along the sidewalk reflected the warm gold of the streetlights instead of flashing police sirens, and the freezing wind that had swept through downtown all evening had settled into a cold stillness. Most of the crowd had slowly disappeared over the last hour, though a few people still lingered near the benches speaking quietly about what they had witnessed. The phones were gone now. The recording had ended. But the feeling of the night remained hanging in the air like steam rising from the wet pavement. Ryan stood beside the folding table near the station entrance wearing only his dark uniform shirt while handing out cups of hot coffee from a cardboard carrier Evelyn had brought from a nearby diner. His movements were slower now. More careful. Every time he passed a cup into someone's trembling hands, he looked directly into their eyes first. Here you go, sir. Stay warm tonight, Small words. Human words. Walter sat wrapped in 2 dry blankets nearby watching him quietly with tired but approving eyes. The younger officer from earlier helped organize socks and medicine along the table without being asked. Even Lieutenant Harris remained longer than expected, speaking with shelter volunteers while occasionally glancing toward Ryan with an unreadable expression. Evelyn sat on the bus bench near the station wall resting her injured leg at last. Ryan's police jacket still hung loosely around her shoulders, far too large for her smaller frame. Steam curled upward from the untouched coffee cup warming her hands. She looked exhausted now that the adrenaline had faded. The kind of exhaustion that reached beyond tonight. Years of carrying people. Years of standing in cold places while trying to keep strangers alive. Ryan noticed she had not stopped helping once. Not even after everything that happened. He walked slowly toward her carrying another blanket folded neatly beneath one arm. The temperature is supposed to drop into the 30s before sunrise, he said quietly. Evelyn looked up at him with tired eyes. Then we should make sure nobody sleeps outside tonight. Ryan nodded once. A few weeks ago he might have heard those words and thought she was naive. Tonight they sounded like truth. He carefully draped the extra blanket across the sleeping veteran at the far end of the bench before sitting beside Evelyn in silence. For a while neither of them spoke. They simply listened to the city breathing around them. Tires hissing across wet streets. A distant train horn. The low hum of buses idling beneath pale clouds drifting across the sky. Ryan stared at his hands for a long moment before finally speaking again. I spent years wanting to become the kind of officer people respected, he admitted quietly. Tonight I realized I stopped trying to become the kind of man my mother would recognize. Evelyn looked down into the steam rising from her coffee cup. Pain changes people, she said softly. Sometimes it hardens them before they notice. Ryan thought about that carefully. Hurricane Katrina. Losing his mother. Years spent chasing authority because it felt safer than vulnerability. Somewhere along the way he had confused control for strength. But Evelyn never had. Even after war. Even after injury. Even after being humiliated in public by the very child she once rescued from floodwater. She still chose compassion. Ryan glanced toward her soaked duffel bag resting beside the bench. Why do you keep doing this every week? He asked quietly. Evelyn smiled faintly without looking up. Because somebody once stayed behind for me too. Ryan felt those words settle deep inside him. The station lights reflected softly across the wet sidewalk while the city moved around them without noticing how much had changed in a single night. Lieutenant Harris finally approached from across the station, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Officer Cole," he said calmly. Ryan stood immediately. Harris studied him for several long seconds before speaking again. "Tomorrow morning, my office. 8 sharp." Ryan nodded once. "Yes, sir." Harris glanced toward Evelyn. "Dr. Brooks," he said respectfully, "the city owes you more than thanks." Evelyn shook her head gently. "No," she replied softly. "Just do not forget the people sleeping under your bridges." Harris lowered his eyes briefly before walking away into the night. Ryan sat back down slowly beside Evelyn as another bus pulled quietly into the station. Warm yellow light spilled across the pavement while tired passengers stepped off carrying backpacks and grocery bags and pieces of ordinary life. For the first time all night, nobody looked away from Evelyn Brooks as they passed her. Some nodded respectfully. One elderly woman even stopped long enough to squeeze her hand gently before boarding the next bus. Ryan watched all of it in silence. Then Evelyn leaned back against the bench with a tired sigh and looked toward the slowly brightening horizon beyond downtown buildings. "Looks like the rain finally passed," she whispered. Ryan followed her gaze. The clouds were breaking apart now, and somewhere far above the city, the first pale hint of morning light had begun to appear.